with that, I am going to turn the meeting over to Dr. Whiteside. I think that he was, as usual, I'm going to dodge the business of making a formal introduction because I've already pretty well covered what I could say in our mailer about this gathering tonight. And it does look to me as though we have filled every seat and a little more. Dr. Whiteside, it's all yours.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks for coming. I want to start by reporting a very near crisis in my health last night when the phone rang and someone called up and said, "Hey, where's the round table?" And I said, "Well, it's at the bank. I believe it's tomorrow night. And if you're right, I'm in trouble." I hope that person's here. Many old friends and some new friends, I welcome you. I'm glad to be welcomed by you. I hope you'll find what I have to say worthwhile. I'm a little bit different in my focal point, I think, from some of you. I don't know whether it was 20, 24, or 30. I thought Phil Wilder's piece in the Bowdoin Alumnus several years ago probably hit it pretty close, 24. But Paul Downing's article, the come on to this evening, spoke of it as 20, I believe, or 21, 20, whichever it was. And he made the clearest explanation, is Paul here? Cole made the clearest explanation I have yet seen of the difference between a regular officer and a brevet officer. I'm still not sure I fully understand it. But because of Paul's article, I'm not going to worry about whether each of the, may I say, 20-odd individuals who achieved general rank in the war, where they went, where they served, and all that stuff. My disposition anyway, being, I suppose, a small d Democrat of sorts, maybe a large D one too, I don't know, is to think more about the junior officers and the rank and file enlisted men. There were more of them. Express them in terms of graduating classes at the college near this building. In William Pitt Fessenden's class, the first to graduate of the three examples I want to take a little time on tonight, there were 31 members, including graduates and non-graduates, all of them as listed in the Bowdoin General Catalog. By 1862, not the last class to contribute service in the war, but the class of Charles P. Maddox, about whom I have a few remarks, which may or may not interest you, there were 57. Now you take that growth, that steady growth in enrollment from then, for that matter, until now, and perhaps into the future, I would take about 45 as a rough average for the period of Bowdoin people showing significant service in the conflict. The number of Bowdoin persons who fought in the war is, dare I say it, I have 264. This is the number reported by the college itself. Is that low, Ed? I thought I saw a frown. As reported by Bowdoin itself, by the dean's office, I assume, or the dean, we didn't have offices in those days, submitted to the Adjutant General of the United States Army in 1867, and published by the War Department in a few years later, 1868, 69, 70, whenever it was. Add to those 264, assuming that's roughly accurate, and I think it probably is, the 16 who served in the Confederate States of America. Their all names are also now engraved in bronze plaques in Memorial Hall. This was the work of Richard Harwell, our librarian in the 60s, and as a native Georgian, and a major authority on Civil War history from the Confederate side. I don't know what Rick's health is now, but if he ever gets back here, I think he'd be a marvelous person to have come in and do the trick. Well, this would be, if you're talking roughly 280 people from the college who served in the conflict on both sides, the overwhelming majority as Union Army people, we have roughly the equivalent of about 6 graduating classes, if my mathematics is correct, figuring an average of about 45 per class. Now, this is the equivalent in the college of its enrollment today, maybe 350, 375 in a class, of maybe 2,000 to 2,500 today. The figures are hard because I keep thinking of graduating classes in terms of the number of graduates. There are always a few more who enter and transfer or for one reason or another drop out. So I think maybe 200, 350 is a little bit stingy. At any rate, that's a rough equivalency indicator that we're talking about a fairly significant chunk of the population of the smaller college coming from a smaller town in a smaller United States in that day. The war and American society should also be considered in statistical perspective, the overall conflict. Most estimates of casualties, fatalities as a result of the war, very likely the people in this room who have a better handle on it than I do, run from 600 to 630,000 combined total Union and Confederate. Anybody want to suggest a better figure? John Pullen feels these are rough figures. I feel they're rough figures. There's an interesting passage in the story of the Confederate forces, the counterpart from the southern side of Bruce Catton for the Union forces, and Shelby Foote, a splendid analysis of these numbers, and his own suspicion that we're really getting rough estimates. But at any rate, this includes battle dead, people actually killed outright on the field of battle, and people who died of disease or wounds or infections, whether or not they're related to battle injuries. It's a substantial number. I do this statistical measure in casualties rather than the even cruder figure that we might try to come up with of total participants, North and South, white and black in the conflict as a whole. But I suppose we ought to multiply that by a sum of at least 4 or 5, or maybe more than that, to get that measure. Well, at any rate, I call it roughly, round figures, 600,000 dead. I think that's a little bit stingy. The United States population in the last federal census before the war started, that is the 1860 census, is roughly 31 million. And since I've shaved my casualty figure a little bit, I'm going to shave the population figure to call it a round number 30 million. This indicates a proportion of the United States population who died in that conflict of 2%, approximately 2%, give or take a decimal point or two, I suppose. The equivalent of this amount of death, of dying, of carnage, of bloodletting, in Vietnam days, when, as we know, a prolonged and frustrating conflict elicited major convulsions in American society, protests and so forth, the effect on 2 presidents who left office directly or indirectly because of that commotion, Johnson and Nixon, is an indicator of the intensity of it. The equivalent of a 2% death rate in Vietnam days for American casualties with a population in the process of passing 200 million would be about 4 million dead. And as we all know, there are probably 58,000 names inscribed in that deeply moving polished marble memorial in Washington to the Vietnam dead from this country. So just imagine what the scale, this is what I have to do, to imagine something of the impact of that war upon American society, upon American politics, upon American college institutions like Bowdoin, upon American life. And we recall the discontent and frustration that was also elicited in the war period. I'm not tonight going to go into the New York draft riots and the Copperheadism and some of those things, but they're all relevant to such a theme. But now, let us leave statistical measures and go into other kinds of things. And let me finish my preliminary or introductory stage with a text from General Joshua Chamberlain, actually Governor or ex-Governor Joshua Chamberlain, speaking about Maine matters, about which more later, at the Philadelphia Centennial or World's Fair, the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876, the centennial year of the Declaration of Independence. Quote, "I do not propose an epitome of historical facts. That were a tedious task." They don't use that verb form so much now as they used to, but it's the correct form, the subjunctive. That were a tedious task. I can't get students to get the indicative right. It's true, Chamberlain thought in 76, after 4 years of struggling in the governorship to sell or to convince the legislators and the public of a program for the future of this state, economic development, growth, manufacturers and industry and all that. And it's also true of Bowdoin College and the war. just try to tick off or try to figure how many did achieve general status, either during the fighting or breveted when they're discharged from active duty, and you get disagreement. But it's true in a different sense as well. You try, or I try in my teaching of this subject at the college, to connect Uncle Tom's Cabin with the career of General O.O. Howard, both the fighting career and the work with the Freedmen's Bureau, and perhaps in his later life, the military action among American Indians in the West. Connect Tom's Cabin with O.O. Howard, with Senator, Secretary of Treasury for a while under Abraham Lincoln, William Pitt Fessenden, one of the great figures of the war period, and his bitter relationship with some of the radical Republicans during Reconstruction, and you try further to incorporate all the manuscript evidence that continues to become available from various sources. And you have a tough job to see common themes. And this is what I would like to try, however crudely and however unsatisfactorily, to do tonight. Let us consider ideas and information under several headings. Running through, though, let us see what this terrible conflict did to this little college and to American education generally, as well as to the larger society. My headings then: Jefferson Davis's summer in Maine and at Bowdoin College. I'll have more on that in a minute. The college in wartime, selected aspects thereof. A few insights gleaned from the diary, which I couldn't bring with me. It's locked up, of Charles P. Mattox, Mattock's, one of those 20-odd people who achieved general rank status by the end of the conflict, and a man who fought and kept an interesting diary, beginning with Chancellorsville and including his incarceration in several different southern prisoner of war camps after his capture and before his clever escape. Then the aftermath of the conflict, Reconstruction and the Radicals, with a focus on the role of William Pitt Fessenden. And then I want to return to Jefferson Davis and that interesting and controversial, as it turns out, honorary degree, and some final reflections. Now, I don't know whether you can stand that much or not. It was one of those warm, pleasant summer, early July nights on the Eastern Promenade in Portland, the sort that one dreams of in February, especially on the eve of a howling nor'easter, hoping they will return. The band performed a harmonious serenade. The listeners then heard the beginning words from the visiting speaker and listened to them carefully. And this, of course, is a reference to the visit of Jefferson Davis to Maine. After the music had ceased, says the editor of the papers, the speeches and other papers of Jefferson Davis, Mr. Davis appeared upon the steps. I don't know who made the introduction. I've not been able to find a record. If I'd had time, or if I'd taken time, I'd have gone to the back issues of the Portland Press and perhaps worked that one out. But Mr. Davis, actually Senator Davis, appeared upon the steps, and as soon as the prolonged applause with which he was greeted subsided, he spoke in substance as follows: Fellow citizens, accept my sincere thanks for this manifestation of your kindness. Well, it's a longer speech. Davis was in Maine because his physician told him to get out of Foggy Bottom. He was suffering some ill health, and seek the restorative powers of the Maine air and the Maine climate and the Maine sunshine. And he was already well along the word to cure when he made this brief appearance, but nobody spoke briefly in those days. It's only today that we speak in well-measured words and short terms. We're going to try to stop before the snowflakes begin. We can't see out the window. We'll have to ask Bert Whitman to go out as a spy from time to time and tell us if we got to get going. When the mother country entered upon her career of oppression in disregard of the chartered constitutional rights, our forefathers did not stop to measure the exact weight of the burden or to ask whether the pressure bore most upon this colony or that colony, but saw it in it the infraction of a great principle, a denial of a common right, in defense of which they made common cause. Massachusetts, Virginia, and South Carolina vying with each other as to who should be foremost in the struggle, where the penalty of failure would be a dishonorable grave. It goes on in that vein, a pleasant remark, conciliatory in nature, emphasizing as much as he can the common cause of the people of the country during the time of the Revolution. And although he didn't use the Lincolnian expression for the fourscore and how many would it be? Fourscore and 1 year since, down into fourscore and two, down until the summer of 1858. Let us, who carry our modern coats of arms on the front and rear automobile bumpers and proclaim ourselves proud residents of vacation land, take note. Shall we change the motto on our next issue of sheet metal and have them read, Jeff Davis slept here? I'll suggest that to Governor McKernan next time I see him to talk to. At any rate, Davis actually spent almost 3 months in coastal Maine. And within a month of this early July speech on the Eastern Promenade overlooking the harbor, I should have read you the evocation of the blue water and the islands and all that lovely view from there, but I didn't put my hand on that, and I won't turn back to it now. But he went on, and he visited Brunswick, and this created, according to Louis Hatch's history of Bowdoin College, though I think he exaggerates it, something of a dilemma for the governing boards of the tiny college of that day. Ordinary protocol would suggest, although now they work out honorary degrees about a year in advance, I think, but ordinary protocol of the simpler days of the mid-18th century would suggest that a visiting statesman of stature who had a visible connection with Bowdoin College through service in the cabinet of a Bowdoin graduate, the only Bowdoin graduate in the White House so far at least, Franklin Pierce, would be granted an honorary degree. Not the snow falling, is it? But no, it wasn't that. It wasn't that at all. It was the It was the fact that this visit was right at the height of the controversy between the Democratic administration of President Buchanan and the anti-slavery objectors, including the new members of the newly formed Republican Party, still in its infancy in 58, run John C. Fremont for the presidency in 56, and would nominate Abe Lincoln 2 years after this visit in 1860. But it's a tense time. Is everything all right, Mr. Randall? Okay, that's a tense time. And so some wondered whether it would be truly in order and appropriate to award an honorary Doctorate of Laws degree, LLD degree, to a distinguished Southern statesman who is not associated with the right side in this conflict. But they swallowed their doubts and went ahead and did it, and the college of former President Franklin Pierce, during whose administration the Kansas trouble started, and they conferred upon Pierce's Secretary of War, of all posts for him to have held, the degree of Doctor of Laws. Thus, Davis became the honorary fellow alumnus of some almost 300 Bowdoin men, as my figures earlier are indicative, who soon would be engaged in the field of battle against the very Confederate States of America for which these people stood. I have discovered recently, poking around special collections with the good help of Susan Rabden, and if you're ever up there looking for help, she's a remarkably well-informed person, as is Diane Dutcher, her fellow worker over there. This document, dated August 7th, 1854, sent by mail to Second Lieutenant Oliver Otis Howard, Ordnance Department, Leeds, Maine, of all places. Sir, you are hereby informed that by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. This is written in handwriting. I don't know if that indicates anything like today in the Congress and the White House or not. The President of the United States has appointed you a brevet, there's that word again, a brevet second lieutenant in the Ordnance Department in the service of the United States of America. The document was signed by Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War, which is one of these connections. I'm not going to do a lot with Howard's career tonight. Some of you may be disappointed, but it does illustrate some of the poignancy of that moment and the succeeding event. Hatch tells the story in his history of the college. I assume he did this part of the research at Bates College because he quotes the Bates College student newspaper after the war broke out. The Bates, what's the name of that paper over there, had the Bates student had a good time making fun, and said that if Davis appeared to any of the Bowdoin people while they're fighting for the Union forces in the war, they should apply to their doctor of laws in this case, for a donation, perhaps of Confederate postage stamps, in support of the capital campaign or whatever it might be, I guess. The Bowdoin Pub Bugle also had some fun with it and said that of Bowdoin men in the Army, if they hear of a stray LLD in their southern rambles, it will devolve upon them as sons of our beloved institution to speedily secure him and send him to Maine. Bowdoin has a little account to settle with him. And on and on. It didn't quite work out that way, did it? Didn't quite work out that way. Well, the college, during the period when the war actually started, of course, life was transformed. And I'm not going to try to go into any of these things in as much detail as they would serve. Unless, between me and whatever's outside, it's a bad night. Is that light needed? I can get along without it. So the college was disrupted. People began dropping out of college to serve in the armed forces. The early classes, 30s and 40s, maybe 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, by the classes of 61, 62, 63, we're getting up in the range of 30 to 35 per graduating class. Really, more than half the classes are withdrawing at one time or the other to go into the war. The same list prepared by the college, which I've already mentioned, says that class of 1823 1, class of 1828 1, class of 1833 1, and so forth and so on. You get up into the 40s, 46, there are as many as 4 men, 47 only 1, 48 5, and so forth. 50s, they get bigger, 1854 6, 1855 6, 1858 15. By the 60s, 1860 29, 61 23, 62 25, and so forth. I thought we had some up here in the 30s, but I guess that is the biggest of 29 if I read these figures correctly. So it becomes and there were drilling units on campus, 2 groups, the Zouaves, and what were the other drilling group called, and they had friendly competition with each other under an officer to teach them close order drill and have them marching around on campus, and that certainly altered the academic atmosphere of that period. And we see Bowdoin people going into the conflict, trying to maintain classes, trying to maintain their studies. The man who managed drill also taught international law, and presumably there was some new interest in the implications of the fighting for the study of the relationships between the United States and the Confederacy. Well, that relationship was clear enough. It was one of fighting for supremacy. Also, in the efforts of the Confederacy to work out an understanding with the British that they might provide the same support for the secessionists as the French had provided for the American colonists in their secession movement from Great Britain back in 1770s and down until the end of the conflict in 1781. There were classes, there were drills, there were departures from enlistments. President Woods of the college, a fascinating individual, medievalist as I recall, and did any of you happen to hear the architectural historian from Williams when he was on campus 2 or 3 years ago giving a lecture on the planning for the construction of the chapel building, the King Chapel and the granite building in Romanesque style. Well, this was largely a product of collusion or bargaining, or an agreement at least, between the college president and the architect, both of whom felt this would be the appropriate architectural style for a different type of building for religious services, and they built it in this style. Well, Woods was not popular with some of the students because Woods, though I wouldn't call him a peacenik in 20th century terms, was not interested in the introduction of studies for rushing off to the war, apparently was not of the opinion that the war should have all this massive support from the men, and he therefore was threw a little bit of cold water on the departures, but he couldn't stem the excitement and the interest, and it went on just the same anyway. Now, during the latter part of the war, the obvious heroism of Joshua Chamberlain, obviously recognized during the war itself and having its climax in his service on Little Round Top, the Battle of Gettysburg in the summer of '63, Chamberlain is becoming apparent as one of the people who would take a leading part in affairs of the world after the war. Chamberlain's career is absolutely fascinating. This young man, boy from Brewer, Maine, I believe, who came to the college and was expected by his mother, and so far as I can tell, expected himself to go into ministerial calling. I can't say that the war took him away from that, because I think he had left that calling anyway in favor of joining the Bowdoin faculty, which he had a chance to do in the late 50s, and to teach the subject for which he showed considerable flair, namely modern languages. Like Longfellow a generation earlier, he could have been a pioneer in modern language development, Longfellow leaving to go to Harvard, and Chamberlain here at Bowdoin. In fact, when the fighting started, it was suggested to Joshua Chamberlain that perhaps because enrollments were down a little bit, he might take leave of absence, go to Europe, continue his language study for a year or two, much as Longfellow had done in an earlier generation, come back and build the program in modern language study. Well, Chamberlain didn't mind the idea of taking leave of absence, but he said he would rather resign from the faculty and throw in his lot with the military forces, and he did so. And this, it seems to me, begins to alter that man's outlook on life, and certainly, I won't say to form his character. I think his character had to be already formed, but to give him an opportunity to express it. So with such distinction that when the war came to an end at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, the surrender ceremony between General Grant and General Lee, a brief and simple affair indoors, ended. The two generals went off to report to their home headquarters and to their respective presidents, and left the remaining service, this great symbol of the significance of this hour, in the hands of Joshua Chamberlain to represent the American, Union forces. It might have been anticlimax, writes Richard Harwell on this. The surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia had been accomplished when Robert E. Lee agreed to the terms laid down by General Grant on April 9th. Only formalities remained. The great commander had left their place of surrender or of triumph. Lee for Richmond, Grant for Washington. But great soldiers remained, the enlisted men, Federal and Confederate, who had faced one another on scores of battlefields and in countless skirmishes. Leading them were two civilian soldiers risen to the high command, General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of Maine and General John B. Gordon of Georgia. It was Chamberlain who, by a single, simple gesture of dignity and compassion, gave character and meaning to that ceremony of formal surrender. 3 days after the actual surrender, on April 12th, who made them not anticlimax, but valediction. And that was the setting, in Richard Harwell's words, for the famous episode in which General Gordon, riding his horse at the head of the first column of Confederate troops, passing in review before the Union troops, then to stack their weapons and give up their colors in abject defeat, and head bowed down, eyes low, dark faces, and so forth. Gordon suddenly looked up. The stories are familiar, and I'm sure to all members of the Civil War Round Table, and found that the Union troops, on orders from General Chamberlain, had taken the stance of salute to honor the Confederate troops before them. And this altered the whole thing. Here is Joshua's letter dated April 13th, just a day later, to his sister about this episode. My dear Sal, I'm glad I was not tempted to leave the Army this spring. I would not for a fortune have missed the experiences of the last 2 weeks. It seems like 2 years. So many and such important events have taken place within that time. Father said in his last letter to me that the glory of battles was over, but if he had seen some of those we have had of late, in which we captured the enemy by thousands and carried their positions by a dash, and at last at Appomattox Courthouse received the surrender of General Lee, he would think differently. For my personal part, I have had the advance every day there was any fighting. Have been in 5 battles, 2 of them being entirely under my direction and brilliantly successful. Twice wounded myself. My horse was shot in the front line when the flag of truce came through from Lee. Had the last shot and the last man killed in this campaign, and yesterday was designated to receive the surrender of the arms of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The bare mention of these facts seems like boasting, but I assure you I did not feel that spirit. I only rejoiced that I was here and bore my part in the crowning triumphs of the war. It was a scene worthy of a pilgrimage. Yesterday, when the old 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division was drawn up to receive the surrender of rebel arms. My brigade, you know, consists of 9 regiments, remnants of the old 5th Corps, veterans of 30 battles. They number about 6,000 men all told. On the right was the old Massachusetts with the remnants of her 9th, 18th, 22nd, and 32nd. Then Maine, her 1st, 2nd, and 20th, Michigan, and all these other regiments ticked off. With my staff and the old flag, the red Maltese cross on a white field with blue border, I took post, and so forth. Well, all right. We received first Major General Gordon with his corps, Stonewall Jackson's, then Longstreet's corps, with Hood's, Anderson's, and Pickett's old divisions, men we had faced a score of times and almost recognized by face. Pickett's splendid division only stacked the 53 muskets and not a single stand of colors. We had so completely used them up at 5 Forks. Last came Hill's corps by divisions, Hill himself having been killed. We received them with the honors due to troops, at a shoulder and in silence. They came to a shoulder on passing my flag and preserved perfect order. When the head of their column reached our left, they halted, faced our line and closed on it, say 4 or 5 yards, and stacked their arms and piled their colors. Poor fellows, I pitied them from the bottom of my heart. Those arms had been well handled and the flags bravely borne. 15,000 stand of arms and 72 flags were stacked before my line. I saw and conversed with nearly all the rebel generals and shall have something to tell you of by and by. So with the affectionate Lawrence. Well, I just think that that outpouring of fellow support of fighters for each other, recognizing that though they're on different sides, the nobility of this conflict was something remarkable to bear, and that this helped set the scene for what President Lincoln, at least, hoped would be the spirit of Reconstruction, a restoration of friendship, a peace without malice but with charity for all, and to get on with the work of the nation, bind up the new wounds and get on with that. I have no reason to believe that President Lincoln expressed any notion to Joshua Chamberlain that this ought to be the theme. I think it was strictly spontaneous from all the evidence we have, and it was a gesture toward reconciliation. Well, here's one handle then, in addition to the Davis business early in the war. I'm not quite prepared to give you summary conclusions of the Mattox diaries. Charles Mattox had the experience of being captured and placed in a rebel prison. He was treated reasonably well. It was nothing like Andersonville, and he managed to make his escape, find his way back to the Union lines, and resume his Union career. But Mattox, I find all of these diaries and other source documents tend to either one of two extremes, well, at least the ones I'm familiar with. I'd be interested to know whether the round table members share this general reaction. They're either just strictly events of the day, another day of rain, marched 8 miles, or not much food for today, or anxious about the battles tomorrow. Or they go to the other extreme. They don't tell you much about the day-to-day, but reflect a great deal on larger implications. Maddox's diary gravitates a little bit toward the first of these two extremes. He talks about Chancellorsville. He draws maps, plans, his own plans, remarkably accurate if you compare them with the formal maps of the battles of that battle. And I think of other episodes in which he did the same thing. But there's really nothing on fighting Joe Hooker and of the controversy surrounding Hooker's conduct of that battle, which the Confederate units scored a victory. No comment either on Stonewall Jackson, who, of course, in victory, an astonishingly clever victory, was shot by his own men who didn't recognize him coming back after dark, thought he was a Union scout or something, and died as a result of the wound incurred on that occasion, with disastrous results in the opinion of General Lee, who reflected after Gettysburg later that if he'd had Stonewall, he thinks that might have turned the trick in the very close conflict between Confederates and Unions in that battle in 63. So Maddox has got useful insights into the conflict, but he stopped short of offering the kind of reflections that would want. Now, what I'm anxious to find, I haven't been able to get into them yet, but I'm anxious to find, thanks to the goodwill of a descendant of Captain Maddox, later Major and later General Maddox, Mr. James White of Boston, who has temporarily stored the diary with Bowdoin College, the alma mater of Maddox, and has also sent a great quantity of manuscript sources, letters, and other matters relating to the war. I'm hoping these will shed more light. The worst of it is that soon after Chancellorsville, Maddox was detailed to return to his own state of Maine, there to receive and induct conscripts, draftees, into the Union forces, give them a little basic workout, and prepare them for moving south to take their position in the Army in the field. And Maddox, while in Bowdoin, attends in the late summer of 1863 the commencement exercise at the college, and beyond a few reflections about the sadness that he and his remaining classmates knew on learning of those who had died as a result of the fighting so far, there's just almost nothing about the condition of the college, the way in which it was operating, his discussions with faculty members or fellow students, younger than himself, and all the stuff you wish he'd set out. But nevertheless, I think here there will be imbalance, perhaps through combining the diary with the other documentary sources. Another interesting view, this one coming not from the famous 20th Maine, which John Pullen has handled so beautifully, but from the 17th Maine, of which I don't think there's a regimental history. Does anyone know to the contrary? For the 17th Maine, Maddox's regiment during the Civil War. But you get these things, and what I'm looking for in Maddox is to see whether there's any evidence that he, like Chamberlain and like others in the war period, emerges from the bitterness of this conflict with a healthy, wholesome, magnanimous, and essentially charitable assessment of the former enemies, the former Confederates, as we move toward the Reconstruction period. In other words, I haven't been able to finish that work. Now, with respect to the later period, I did want to say a word about William Pitt Fessenden. Senator Fessenden served in the Senate before the war in the 50s and during most of the war. And it was so flexible in those days. You remember, of course, that senators in that period were elected by state legislatures. They were not subject to popular election and all the campaigning and nominations and the general elections and all that might make it much more cumbersome. For example, when Webster and Hayne engaged in the great debate between North and South over which were the New Englanders or Southerners, were closer in their policies and in their attitudes to the spirit of the western part of the United States. Hayne, senator from South Carolina, was taking the debate because the leading South Carolina statesman at the time of the Webster Haynes days, first administration of Andrew Jackson, was in the vice presidential office. John C. Calhoun was Jackson's vice president. And in the dismay, the patent dismay of Andrew Jackson, President Jackson, toward these fellow Southerners, Jackson was from Tennessee, who were talking nullification, violating federal law, and all of that, Hayne was the spokesman in the debate, and he and Webster had it out. But then Calhoun did what I don't think any vice president has done since then, except Spiro Agnew. He resigned from the office for somewhat different reasons, to be sure. Went back to South Carolina. Hayne resigned the senatorship and was promptly elected to the governorship of South Carolina, and Calhoun became senator now, no longer vice president, in the presiding seat before the Senate, but not in a position to join the debate. And then he took over in the debate, classic debate over State of the Union. It was very much the same thing in Fessenden. Well, it's not the same in terms of the conflict side, but the flexibility. Fessenden resigned from the cabinet, or from the Senate, in order to accept appointment tendered by Abraham Lincoln to succeed Chase as Secretary, Solomon P. Chase as Secretary of the Treasury during the last year of the war. That mission completed, the war over, Lincoln dead through the assassin's bullet, and a new administration coming in. Fessenden resigned the cabinet post and went back, and once again was sent promptly by the Maine legislature to the state Senate. Well, Fessenden, highly respected figure, Republican figure, moderate Republican, not entirely on good terms with all of the radical Republicans, so-called radical, not because they were politically at the left, but because they had what was called in those days a radical stance on the question of the treatment of the South, the defeated South in Reconstruction, whether to follow Lincoln's magnanimous program or whether to ensure that Southerners accepted the outcome of the war in good faith and would do the necessary things in order to qualify for going on from there. Well, all right, so Fessenden faces the problem that he agreed with the radical Republicans on one point. He held Andrew Johnson in a certain degree of contempt. And he did not like his character, and he did not like his policies. But he disagreed with the radical Republicans in the Senate on another matter, and that was and in the Congress too. Both houses had to get together on an impeachment process. Fessenden disagreed as a matter of constitutional principle on the question of the removal of the President of the United States from office via the impeachment route for anything other than as the Constitution puts it, high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, Fessenden believed Johnson had been politically wrong as a statesman, misguided in his judgment, simply perniciously wrong in his actions on some of the policies of the day. But he did not feel that Johnson should be removed from office except through the electoral process, waiting until the next election came along in 1868, and then putting up a candidate who would take the Republican standard and represent it. And of course, Johnson came up into this, what was called a National Union ticket in 1864, as an old Tennessee Democrat, but a war Democrat, a Democrat from the moderate South, border South, well, upland South. My parents are Tennesseans. I want to be careful how I describe it. And Johnson did not get along at all with the radical Republicans or vice versa. So here comes the impeachment in the House of Representatives and the trial before the bar of the Senate of Andrew Johnson with respect to the impeachment, the removal of office for having committed high crimes and misdemeanors by violating the Tenure of Office Act and by doing certain other things. Well, all right, Fessenden resisted the tide on this issue. And he was one, in order to block the removal from office, you had to have votes of, you had the votes of the Democrats, about 12 in number. You needed a total of 19 to block the removal from office. And this required 7 Republican votes in the Senate. Well, Fessenden was one of those 7, voted no to the question put from the clerk, whether to remove President Johnson from office under the impeachment route, and Fessenden did that. Well, what I think is in common, I don't know if you'll accept this, I see some problems with it myself, is that Fessenden, like those who received Jefferson Davis back before the war, like Joshua Chamberlain, giving the order to salute the defeated troops at the surrender ceremony, now in the Reconstruction period, we have William Pitt Fessenden leading those who would remove the president from office via the impeachment route. Well, this brings up another thing. After that honorary diploma honorary degree, there was a diploma attached, of Doctor of Laws had been conferred upon Jefferson Davis in 1858, and the fact that within 3 years, less than 3 years, Davis had resigned his seat in the Senate from Mississippi and had accepted election as the President of the Confederate States of America. And the governing boards of the college, already somewhat ambivalent about the award of that degree in the first place, were under constraint to revoke the degree, to send a letter to the aging president, former president of the Confederate States of America, down in Beauvoir in Mississippi, his home, where no longer in jail, no longer incarcerated. He was living out his remaining days with his wife, Verona. And the college refrained from exercising this. It was expressed. We don't have full records. We don't have a record of the honorary degree citation. We don't have records of governing board's discussions of the removal process. I don't believe there is any reference to it in the board's minutes, except, of course, if there had been a vote to revoke the degree, that would have been recorded, and there's negative evidence there. There is no such degree. But it seems clear that the governing boards of the college in the war period and the immediate post-war period took the line that degrees are conferred, whether they're earned degrees by students who go for 4 years or honorary degrees conferred for distinction upon public figures of literary or governmental service or whatever. Once that's done, the degree stands. You don't know what's going to come of the young people when you give them the bachelor's degrees on commencement day. You don't know what's going to become of an honorary degree recipient either. But if that behavior has been less than exemplary, you let the degree stand. In my mind, one of the great statesman-like gestures of the war period by Bowdoin College. Jefferson Davis, therefore, the degree stood. And in 1889, just a few months before his death, which was in December of that year, under date July 3rd, 1899, we have in the college collection up in the third floor of the library a fascinating manuscript letter from Jefferson Davis to one Joseph Williamson. He was, I believe, in the role of clerk or secretary to the college. I'm not quite sure what his role was. And this letter was in response to Mr. Williamson having sent to Jefferson Davis, I don't know why it was done, a copy of the current Bowdoin College catalog. And here is the gracious reply, in part. Some newspapers had circulated a report that Bowdoin College had revoked the honorary degree conferred upon me, and it was with no small gratification that I found in the catalog which you have sent me evidence that the administration of Bowdoin were incapable of such spite, which could only originate from sectionalism. Complimented beyond my desert in the honor conferred, I felt a corresponding pride in the institution to which I was so indebted. During my long and pleasant stay in Maine, I formed many friendships, the memory of which remains. 2 of those you mentioned as having passed over the river, and 1, my contemporary in the Senate, as being present at the commencement to observe the 64th anniversary of his graduation. I hope it may be granted to him to observe many more. Is there anyone in the room who knows who that colleague in the Senate was, Bowdoin graduate, celebrating? It can't be Fessenden. Fessenden and Davis were colleagues in the Senate at the same time, but Fessenden died in 1869. so he could not have been attending a reunion in the year 1887. And if he were, it wouldn't be his 64th, it would have been his 66th. He was class of 23. I don't know anything about the gentleman. The other senator was not Fessenden, but it was James Ware Bradbury, class of 1825, who served one term in the Senate in the early 1850s. My thesis in talking about these things in a strictly Bowdoin student audience, which I do because I'm teaching a course in the Civil War, is to hold before them these examples of charity and magnanimity, not as evidences of weakness, but as evidence of the larger transcendence of wartime passions by major figures in the conflict associated with this town and with this college. Those who received and graciously received Jefferson Davis, Senator from Mississippi, in 1858, the college which voted him a degree and refrained from rescinding it. Those who fought in the war, like Maddox and Chamberlain, fought with spirit, fought with suffering the results, one in the case of imprisonment, one in the case of very severe wounds, which plagued him the rest of his life, and yet were able to maintain an attitude very comparable, I think, to Abraham Lincoln's right up until his death, of conciliation toward the defeated enemy. And finally, Fessenden in this role. These serve a remarkable example of keeping bearings in a time of hatred, passion, fighting, killing, and dying in a war which is uncommon. Beyond that, what did the war do to Bowdoin College? When I accepted John Hoskin's visit and Mr. Randall's kind invitation to come here and talk to you, I had thought what I was going to say is that the war permanently and unalterably transformed the college. I still think it did, but I think it's a more complex question than I had earlier conceived of it as being. Take Chamberlain, for example. After he returned to civilian life, he was visited by a committee representing the Republican Party of the state of Maine, and he was asked to accept nomination to run for, and he did so, and he won election to, the governorship. He served 4 terms. They were annual terms in those days. During that period, 1867 to 1871, Joshua Chamberlain presented to the people of the state of Maine a program for the future of the state, which he could hardly have conceived of in the pre-Civil War days. At least I believe this to be the case. I have no documentary evidence it's the case. He wanted Maine to industrialize. He wanted Maine to become a forward-looking state. He wanted Maine to join the battle with Boston and with New York and Philadelphia and with the new industrializing part of the Union. He felt it could be done. He commissioned a study done by a man named Wells of the water powers of the state of Maine. Water powers means a sufficient drop in water level on a stream, as the term seems a quaint one to me was used, and we could harness this power and turn spindles and turn sawmills and generate power needed for a variety of industrial enterprises. We can build a railway into the hinterland. We can connect Portland with Chicago and the West Coast since the recent building of the Union Pacific, the Promontory Point Golden Spike having been driven in 1868. There's no reason for Maine, which is a half day closer to the European ports across the ocean than the port of New York or even the port of Boston, a little bit closer. We can develop this position. Well, he really received, I think, a stony response. He did not get very much enthusiasm from the legislators or his fellow government officials in Augusta. And he would like to have gone this route. His annual addresses in the State Library in Augusta are a marvel to read for their articulation of goals for the future. Chamberlain was afraid that Maine's glorious days were past. Only 2 states in the Union, between the pre-Civil War census, to which I already referred in another connection, 1860, and the first post-war census of 1870, only New Hampshire and Maine showed a net drop in population. Chamberlain wanted to keep the young people here, provide jobs and factories, things to do, and see the state undergo a rapid modernization. He only got the faintest glimmer of success in that program. And then after the governorship over, he comes back to alma mater, and he's appointed to the presidency of the college and served for the decade until 1882, for the decade of the 70s. And during that period, Chamberlain begins urging upon his own college a similar program, a school of engineering, a program in science. Bowdoin should not forsake the liberal arts, but Bowdoin should broaden out and become, I don't think it's extravagant to say, something like the MIT of Maine, training people to play these new roles. Here again, he fell into a relationship with the trustees and overseers, perhaps the faculty and students as well, which represented only the most minimal response. And of course, the big single symbol of the discontent was the drill program which he innovated and which the students revolted against in 1873, refusing to spend money from their for their uniforms in order to participate in what today would be called, I suppose, ROTC drill. Of course, that's gone from Bowdoin too, hasn't it, Ed? But there's a program that Chamberlain's putting forward calling for shaking off the dusty past and moving forward boldly into the future. And I'm sure that he felt frustrated on these scores, both in state government and in college administration, far greater than frustrations he had encountered in the field of battle during the fighting of the Civil War. However, having said that, I would go on to say that when Chamberlain left the presidency, it was turned over to a young minister. Sounds like a reversion to old days, William DeWitt Hyde. And William DeWitt Hyde came over and took the college, and although the rhetoric was quite different from Chamberlain's, and although the personality and the daring was quite different, Hyde was able, he didn't bring about a science program. Well, he brought in some modern sciences, yes. He didn't bring in an engineering program, but he did begin to broaden the curriculum and introduce elective options at Bowdoin. So I think the college is undergoing significant change. Would never go back to what it had been before the Civil War, for better or for worse. Well, those would be my remarks on what I regard as the spirit of magnanimity which these people functioning, representing Bowdoin at its best and functioning before, during, and after the war. And these would be my thoughts about some of the consequences for the war. Bert, has it started snowing? I'll stop now. And if there's discussion, I'm glad to stay as long as you like. Thank you for letting me join you.